It was one of those nights where everything felt off, like I was floating in my own life, but couldn't quite feel the ground beneath me. I'd been married to James for almost 10 years, and for the past few of those, it was like I was just another fixture in the house, part of the decor. He was consumed by his work, always on the phone, always behind a laptop or in meetings. It didn't matter that we had once shared everything, dreams, laughter, sex. It felt like I was just the wife who made sure dinner was on the table and the house was still standing when he got home. I remember that party clearly. It was for James's business associates, high rollers in the city, all of them more concerned with their power and money than any real human connection. I didn't want to go. I was tired of being the background figure in James's glamorous life, of playing the part of the perfect wife who stood in the corner, smiling politely while he talked shop with his clients. But James insisted. "It'll be good for your image," he said, as if I cared about that anymore. That's when I met Cade. He was there to discuss potential investments with James, and from the moment I shook his hand, I could tell he was different. He had this air about him, like he knew exactly who he was and what he wanted from life. Late 40s, ruggedly handsome in a way that wasn't polished or fake. Something about him made me feel seen, even though I had never felt more invisible in my marriage. He wasn't trying to impress me. He wasn't even flirting, not directly. We talked business at first, of course, and I'd be lying if I didn't admit I was impressed by the way he moved through the room, chatting with the most important people and making them all feel like they were the only ones who mattered. By the end of the evening, I realized something. Cade wasn't just another businessman. He saw something in me, something James hadn't noticed in a long time. He made me feel like I mattered, like I had potential that went beyond being the perfect wife. The way he listened, the questions he asked, the way his eyes didn't just skim over me. He made me feel like I could be more than the woman who spent her days catering to her husband's every need. Over the next few weeks, Cade started to reach out. "We should meet for lunch," he suggested one day, telling me about some investment opportunities one might be interested in. I figured it was just business at first, but then he began arranging lunches with other influential businessmen, introductions to high-profile government officials. It was more than just work. For the first time in years, I felt respected for who I was, not just for being married to James, but as a person with my own potential, my own ideas. It was intoxicating. At some point, I realized I was looking forward to my meetings with Cade. More than I should have. He didn't just offer business advice. He gave me something James never did anymore: attention. I found myself dressing differently for our meetings, paying more attention to how I looked, hoping he would notice. I knew it wasn't right, but I couldn't stop it. Things slowly started to shift. Cade invited me to private events, intimate dinners where the conversation went beyond business. We mingled with the city's high society, talking about art, politics, ideas, things James never cared to discuss with me anymore. The more I spent time with Cade, the more I realized that he wasn't just helping me in my career. He was starting to fill a void I didn't even realize existed. It wasn't just business anymore. At first, I tried to tell myself I told myself I was just taking advantage of the opportunities he was offering. But the truth is, I was enjoying the attention. I was enjoying the way he made me feel like I mattered, like I was more than just a wife. And that was the problem. I started craving that feeling. When he looked at me, it wasn't with pity or obligation. It was with interest. Genuine interest. The line between professional and personal began to blur. It wasn't an obvious thing at first. We still talked about business, mostly anyway, but there were moments, small things. The way he brushed his hand against mine when we were seated at a dinner table. The way he smiled at me, just a little longer than necessary. He started telling me about his personal life, about the people who mattered to him, the things he enjoyed doing. And I started sharing things with him too. Things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. I never told James about these meetings. At first, it didn't seem necessary. It wasn't like I was doing anything wrong, right? But as Cade and I started spending more time together, things changed. I could feel myself getting pulled into something deeper, something I didn't want to acknowledge. I told myself it was just business. That's all it was. But at night, when I'd lie in bed next to James, I couldn't stop thinking about Cade. What would it be like to be with someone who actually saw me? Someone who didn't just want me for what I could do for him, but valued me for who I was. I didn't realize how far it had gone until the night he invited me over after a business event. I should have known it would happen, but I didn't. And when I walked into his apartment that night, something inside me just broke. I had never felt so alive. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, or the way his touch lingered. It was like he was seeing me for the first time, and it felt like a drug I couldn't quit. I don't know when it stopped being about business and started being about us, but I couldn't pretend anymore. What started as a few lunches and meetings turned into something else, something I couldn't control. And once I crossed that line, there was no going back. With every meeting with Cade, I started slipping further away from James. It wasn't just about wanting attention anymore. It was something deeper. I craved the kind of validation I had never felt in my marriage, but more than that, Cade was offering me power. Real power. The kind I had never had before. I'd never been the one in control. Never been the one to make the decisions that others listened to. But with Cade, everything changed. He'd introduced me to people who could change my life. Businessmen, government officials. People who saw me not as James Stewart's wife, but as someone in her own right. Someone important. Every time I saw him, every time he made me feel seen, I felt like I was stepping further away from the woman I was with James and closer to a new version of myself. I didn't even know who that woman was anymore, but I didn't care. She felt stronger, more independent, more alive. Cade didn't just offer me business opportunities. He offered me something more dangerous. He gave me attention that made me feel good in ways I hadn't felt in so long. Every glance, every smile, every touch, it was like he knew exactly how to make me feel wanted, needed. I started looking forward to our meetings more than I should have. Each time we talked, he'd make me feel like I was special, like I was worth something outside of my marriage. I wasn't just James's wife. I was Emily Stewart, a woman with her own value, her own desires. I kept telling myself that it was just business, that I was just networking, learning more, expanding my world. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. And yet, I couldn't stop it. One night, after another of those charity events, Cade invited me to his place. I had no idea what I was expecting, but I knew something was about to change. We had always kept things professional up until then, but there was this tension between us, something thick and unspoken. We'd had a few drinks, shared some stories about business, about life, but the moment he leaned in, everything else disappeared. His lips on mine was the only thing that mattered. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the breaking point. After that, nothing was ever the same. We spent the night together. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Just pure need. The next morning, I woke up in his bed, tangled in the sheets, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel empty. The woman I had been, James's wife, the woman who existed in the shadows of his life, she was gone. In her place was someone new, someone with desires, with needs, with a hunger I hadn't realized I had. I didn't even know what to feel. I didn't feel guilty. Not really. I had told myself for so long that it was James who was too distant, too focused on work, too wrapped up in his own world to give me what I needed. I had told myself that he was the one who had let me slip away, that I had tried, but I had to take care of myself. And now, with Cade, I felt seen. I felt desired. James, of course, had no clue. He was too wrapped up in his own world to notice the small changes in mine. I spent more and more time with Cade, and when I was home, I wasn't really there. My mind was elsewhere. But James was too consumed with his work to notice the shift in me. He didn't care about the late nights, the empty house, the way I wasn't interested in hearing about his day. Why would he? He was busy. He was making deals, closing contracts, moving forward. That's all he cared about. I wasn't important anymore. But James, as busy as he was, eventually started noticing something wasn't right. I'd been careful, or so I thought. But when he was reviewing some financials one day, something caught his eye. There were payments, large ones, tied to accounts connected to Cade. At first, James probably thought it was a mistake. But he kept digging. The more he dug, the more he found. He wasn't an idiot. It didn't take him long to figure out that something was wrong. I didn't know exactly when he figured it out, but it was clear by the way he started acting. The way he looked at me. The way he became more distant, more cold. When he started looking through my emails, I'm sure it wasn't because he suspected something. I think it was more that he didn't want to believe what was staring him in the face. He saw the emails between Cade and me, the ones that started out professionally but had slowly shifted. He could see it in the language we used. The personal touches, the subtle flirtations. I didn't even notice how it had changed until it was too late. Until he read it all. The moment he found it, I knew things would never be the same. He didn't confront me immediately. He didn't say anything. He just watched. I think he was hoping I'd stop, that I'd pull back, that I'd realize what I was doing and fix it. But I wasn't going to fix anything. I was done trying to hold it all together. I had finally found something that made me feel alive, and I wasn't about to let it go. James must have felt like his world had come crashing down. For the first time in years, he saw what was happening in front of him. His wife was leaving him. And it wasn't just for someone else. It was for a life he couldn't give me. He couldn't offer me what Cade had. Not anymore. I waited for the confrontation, the inevitable argument, but it never came. At least, not right away. He didn't even try to fight me. He just withdrew. There were no harsh words, no accusations, just silence. I could tell he was devastated, but I wasn't sure what he wanted from me. Maybe he was waiting for me to feel guilty. But I didn't. I didn't feel anything for him anymore. I knew then that I had changed, that everything I had been before, James's wife, the woman who stayed at home and played the dutiful spouse, was gone. Cade had opened something in me I hadn't even known was there. And I wasn't about to go back to being the woman who had just played a part in someone else's life. I was someone else now, someone with power, someone who was desired. James was a man who, despite his usual cold detachment, wasn't going to take this kind of betrayal lying down. He didn't just see this as an affair. It was a direct hit to his pride, his ego, and his business. Cade Harris had used him, had used us to further his own shady deals, taking advantage of James's reputation and connections. James's world wasn't just about business. It was about maintaining control, maintaining the image of success and power. When that image started to crack, it was like someone had hit him with a sledgehammer. But James wasn't the kind of man to let something like this destroy him. He was going to make Cade pay, and he was going to do it in the most calculated way possible. It didn't take long for him to start working on his revenge. He had the resources, the connections, and the power to go after Cade in a way that would leave him in ruins. James had always kept close ties with certain government agencies and business regulators, and now was the time to use them. He didn't hesitate to call in favors, to make calls that would put Cade under pressure. James started feeding the right people information about Cade's business practices, leaking internal reports about tax evasions, fraudulent transactions, and his company's connections to illicit deals. Cade's world began to crumble piece by piece. At first, it was subtle, a small audit here, an investigation there. But soon enough, the cracks started showing, and Cade's empire began to crumble. What followed were full-blown state audits and investigations, something that no businessman, especially one with as much dirt on him as Cade, could easily weather. James made sure that every document that painted Cade in a bad light was passed around the right circles, that every accusation found its way into the media. It wasn't just about getting revenge for the affair. It was about destroying everything Cade had worked for. Every time he saw a headline about Cade's financial instability, James's grin grew a little wider. He wasn't going to let Cade walk away from this, not without suffering the consequences. But James wasn't done. What I had done with Cade had affected him on a personal level, but his revenge wasn't just going to be about taking Cade down. It was about making me suffer too. He wasn't just going to destroy the man who had betrayed him. He was going to make me feel the sting of what I had done. And so, he turned his sights on someone else. I didn't see it coming at first. When James started spending more time with Laura, I thought nothing of it. My sister had always been the quieter one, the one who was happy to play the second fiddle to me. I'd always been the one who got the attention, the one who had the successful husband, the high-powered life. But after everything with Cade came to light, something shifted. I started noticing things, subtle changes in the way Laura acted. She was quieter when I was around. Her phone seemed to always be glued to her hand, and she would disappear for hours at a time. At first, I thought she was just processing the fallout of everything, maybe even feeling bad for me. I hadn't expected her to be part of this drama. She had always stayed out of the way, never getting involved in any of my issues. But the more I watched her, the more it became clear that something was happening. Something between her and James. I never suspected that James, of all people, would go after Laura. She had always been in the background, not someone he had ever shown much interest in. But after everything that happened between us, it seemed that Laura had become a pawn in his game of revenge. And she was playing it perfectly. Laura had always been emotionally distant, but now she was craving something more: attention, validation, the things that James could offer her now that he was no longer interested in me. I guess it was only a matter of time before she fell for it. I didn't realize just how deep things had gone between them until one night, when I came home early. I'd just been out with some friends, trying to distract myself from everything that had happened. And when I opened the door, I heard them. Their laughter, the low murmur of their voices. Something about the way they spoke to each other sent a chill down my spine. It was intimate. Too intimate for just a brother-in-law and his sister-in-law. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. When they saw me, everything stopped. The room went dead silent. Laura's face flushed bright red, and James? Well, he just gave me a look that said everything. I wasn't sure if he was ashamed, or if he even cared that I had caught them. But his eyes told me one thing. He was getting his revenge, and he was doing it right under my nose. I didn't say anything at first. I couldn't. I just stood there, feeling the walls close in on me. Laura tried to explain, but I wasn't listening. All I could hear was the mocking silence in my own head, the knowledge that the woman I had trusted, the woman who was supposed to be my sister, had done exactly what I had done to James, had betrayed me. And worse, she had done it with him, with my husband. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw something to make them feel the pain that was stabbing at my chest. But I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as they continued to hide behind the smokescreen of their lies, knowing that this was just one more part of the game James had started. From that moment, everything changed between us. The dynamic shifted in a way that was irreversible. James and Laura were no longer just part of the background noise of my life. They had become players in a game I had never signed up for. I thought I had the upper hand with Cade, that I had everything I wanted, but in the end, it was James who had the last laugh. He had played me perfectly, and now he had turned the tables on me in the most humiliating way possible. As Emily's world crumbled, the realization of how deeply she'd screwed up began to hit. Her affair with Cade had not only torn apart her marriage, but it had also set off a chain reaction she couldn't stop. For the longest time, she had thought she was in control, thought she could keep her two lives separate. But now, the damage was undeniable. It wasn't just the loss of James. It was the whole unraveling of everything she'd worked so hard to build. Her affair had destroyed her family, her reputation, and now, even her escape with Cade had come crashing down. It was the quiet way James had started to act that really drove the point home. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way she expected. He didn't shout or scream. He was eerily calm. In fact, he was colder than ever. But there was something in his calmness that terrified her. The more she tried to apologize, the more he looked at her as if she was a nuisance, a thing to be discarded. Every time they spoke, she could feel him gaining ground on her. He was using everything he knew about her affair with Cade against her, and it was working. And then there was that call from Cade. She had been waiting for him to reach out, desperate for him to tell her that he was okay, that they could still make it work. But instead, what she got was a man completely shattered. Cade, the man who had promised her power and excitement, was now on the brink of losing everything. When she heard his voice on the phone, it was different, hoarse, desperate. He was furious, not at her, but at himself, at the world closing in on him. The government investigations, the audits, the press, it was all happening, and Cade had no way to stop it. "Emily, you have to leave it. It's too late," Cade had said. His voice crackled with panic. "The business is going down, and I don't know how to fix this." She had tried to reassure him, try to talk him down, but it was clear that Cade was done. It was too much for him to handle. The walls were closing in on him, and with that, her dreams of a life with him vanished. She had built this whole fantasy around him, around what he could offer her. And now, like everything else in her life, it was collapsing. Her lover was sinking fast, and she was left with nothing but the remnants of what could have been. Desperation set in. She tried calling him again, texting him. Nothing. He had cut her off. He was a proud man, and as much as Emily wanted to believe in the power he had once promised her, now it was clear he wasn't going to save her. Cade's pride wouldn't allow him to admit the depth of his failure. So, Emily was left holding the bag. She had no husband, no lover, and no one to turn to. She was a woman on an island of her own making, and the tide was rising fast. Her next confrontation wasn't with Cade, but with Laura. The signs had been there for weeks. Things had been off with her sister. At first, Emily had chalked it up to her own paranoia, but as time went on, the pieces started to fit together. Laura had been different lately. She was more confident, more assertive, and always seemed to be around when James was. Emily's suspicion grew, and she couldn't ignore it any longer. So one evening, she confronted Laura. The confrontation was ugly. It wasn't just that Laura had betrayed her. It was that Laura had been playing a game of her own. When Emily confronted her about the affair, Laura didn't even try to hide the satisfaction in her eyes. In fact, she seemed almost smug. "You think you're the only one who can have what she wants." Laura sneered. "You've always had everything, Em. The perfect life, the perfect husband. I wanted that too. I wanted to see what it was like. And now I have it." The words cut through Emily like a knife. Her sister, the one person she thought she could trust, had been plotting against her for months. Laura had always lived in Emily's shadow, but now she had found her chance to tear it all down. This wasn't just about a husband or an affair. It was about Laura trying to prove something, about taking everything Emily had worked so hard for. "You think I did this for you?" Emily's voice shook with anger, disbelief. "You were always jealous. You envied me, didn't you?" Laura didn't deny it. "You always had it all, Emily. The perfect life, the perfect marriage, and I was just here, watching. I wanted a taste of what you had. And now, I've got it." The words were poison, each one worse than the last. Emily felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Not only had James betrayed her, but her own sister had stabbed her in the back. The anger, the hurt, it all mixed together, leaving her raw and exposed. The fight didn't last long. Emily couldn't stand to hear any more of it. She stormed out, but the damage was done. Everything she had once taken for granted was slipping through her fingers. Her marriage, her family, everything was falling apart. James, meanwhile, was getting exactly what he wanted. His revenge had already begun to materialize. Cade's businesses were falling apart in front of everyone's eyes. The media was all over it, and the government investigations had turned up enough dirt to bury Cade's entire empire. As the details of Cade's shady deals came to light, his reputation was destroyed. The man who had once been so powerful was now a joke, scrambling to stay afloat. James, of course, couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at the sight of it all. He had won. He had beaten Cade, and he had beaten Emily. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. He couldn't look away, but he knew there was nothing left to salvage. Meanwhile, his life with Laura progressed. The affair was no longer a secret. Everyone knew, and Emily was forced to watch as the two of them lived out the life she had once dreamed of, flaunting their new relationship in her face. The worst part was that Emily couldn't stop it. She couldn't stop James from moving on, couldn't stop Laura from playing the part of the woman who had won it all. As for Emily, she was left behind, lost, alone, and humiliated. James had taken everything from her, and now he was walking away with Laura. The revenge he had plotted so carefully was a complete success. For James, this was more than just an affair. It was a declaration of power, a way to show the world that he was in control. And Emily? She was the one who had lost it all. As the dust settled and the world around Emily crumbled, James wasted no time in making his final move. Everything had been laid bare. The affair, the betrayal, the power shifts. And now it was time for him to take control of the one last thing that had been holding him back, the marriage itself. With a chilling calmness, he laid out his ultimatum, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "Accept the terms of the divorce, Emily," he said, his voice cold, calculating, "or I'll keep making your life a living hell." Emily had been stripped of everything already. Her lover was gone, her sister had sided with James, and the very foundation of her life had been torn apart. She had no leverage left, no allies to turn to, nothing. James had all the power now. He held the keys to her social reputation, her financial future, and any hope of finding peace. Emily knew she couldn't fight this battle. She had lost long ago, and now it was just a matter of how bad the fallout would be. With the divorce papers filed, the legal battle began. It wasn't long before Emily saw her world crumble before her eyes. The house, the home she had once poured so much of herself into, was up for sale. The press had a field day, dissecting every aspect of their private lives, and Emily was the villain in every headline. James, with his business acumen and ruthless instincts, made sure that he came out on top, taking the majority of their shared assets. His strategy was impeccable, while Emily was left to pick up the shattered pieces of what had once been her glamorous life. The divorce was a quick, brutal affair. James walked away with the family business, the investments, and the lion's share of their financial assets. Emily, on the other hand, was left with mounting debts and a reputation that had been irreparably damaged. The judge ruled in James's favor, and the settlement was a harsh reminder of how completely he had turned the tables. Emily had no power now, no way to reverse the damage. What had once been her life, her success, her future, was now just a distant memory. The emotional toll, however, was far more devastating than the financial. Emily found herself alone, isolated, and consumed with regret. Cade, who had once been her escape, was no longer there. His empire was in ruins, and he had cut her off completely, unable to handle the pressure of the fallout from the affair. Even Laura, her own sister, was no comfort. Laura was too entangled in her relationship with James to offer any sympathy, and Emily soon realized that the betrayal from her sister was as deep as the one from her husband. It was as if everyone had abandoned her. Her world had shrunk to nothing, a small, lonely place where every door seemed to close. With no one left to turn to, Emily knew she had to start over. But how do you rebuild a life when everything you had is gone? How do you recover from the destruction of everything you thought you'd built? Emily didn't know. All she knew was that it wouldn't be easy. She wasn't the woman who had it all anymore. She wasn't the woman who had power, influence, or respect. She was just someone trying to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered by her own hands. James, meanwhile, was thriving. The divorce was behind him, and his empire was growing even larger. His business deals became more lucrative, and his reputation in both business and politics soared. No longer hiding in the shadows, he openly flaunted his new life with Laura. She was no longer just his affair. She was his partner, his equal in the eyes of the public. Together, they became a power couple, enjoying the fruits of his calculated ruthlessness. James held a celebration to mark the beginning of his new life. It was grand, extravagant, even. The lavish event was filled with business associates, political figures, and friends, all of whom admired his drive and cunning. There was no mention of Emily, no acknowledgement of the destruction he had left in his wake. For James, this was his victory lap, a moment to toast to the future he had created, one in which he was on top, unchallenged. For Emily, though, the world seemed impossibly bleak. As she watched from the sidelines, her heart heavy with regret, she knew that she would never get back what she had lost. She had been defeated, not just by her husband, but by her own choices. She had thrown everything away in search of something. What? Power? Control? A fleeting moment of freedom? In the end, she had nothing. And James? James was secure in his new life, his new world, surrounded by people who admired him, who respected him. The weight of his victory pressed down on Emily, and she could only watch as he moved forward, leaving her in the dust. Her path was uncertain. All Emily could do now was try to rebuild, but it was clear that the woman she had been was gone. In the wreckage of her choices, there was no easy way out. James's new venture launched with all the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just starting a business. He was solidifying his place at the top. This new company quickly became a massive success, and it didn't take long for his name to resurface in headlines. The industry took notice, as did his competitors, who had once underestimated him. But now, with the help of a new partner who was as ambitious and brilliant as James, They built an empire that rivaled some of the biggest corporations in the country. It was a masterstroke of business acumen, and James had orchestrated every step of it. He had taken control of his life in ways that few could imagine, bending the world around him to his will, and the rewards were more than just financial. He had become untouchable, a figure of power, both feared and admired. Meanwhile, Emily's life was a stark contrast. Where James was expanding, thriving, and consolidating his success, she was struggling to rebuild. The life of luxury she had once enjoyed was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of hard work and financial struggle. She had lost everything: her reputation, her wealth, her relationships, and now she was fighting to survive. Emily had to find a job in an entirely different field, something that kept her out of the public eye. It was a humbling experience, and every day felt like a battle. But despite everything she had lost, Emily refused to let herself be defeated. She knew she couldn't regain what she had once had, but she wasn't going to let that be the end of her story. The woman who had once had everything was gone, but in her place was someone who was determined to rise again. It would take time, but Emily slowly began to rebuild her life. She made new connections, found her independence again, and started to find some peace. But deep down, she knew she would never be the same. James had won, but in doing so, he had changed her. The transformation wasn't just about her circumstances. It was about who she had become. She was no longer the woman she had been before the affair, before the revenge, before the destruction. And though she might never regain her former glory, she would no longer be a victim. The price she'd paid for her mistakes had been high, but Emily was finding her way forward, one step at a time. James, on the other hand, was in a perpetual state of celebration. Every success, every new milestone, was a reminder of how far he had come. He had everything he had ever wanted: power, wealth, respect, and the unwavering satisfaction of knowing that his enemies had been thoroughly crushed. He had destroyed Cade, destroyed Emily, and built a life that was beyond anything he could have imagined. But as the years went on, James began to realize that, for all his triumphs, there was something missing. The victory had come at a steep cost, one that he hadn't fully understood until now. The affair, the revenge, the shattered relationships, he had made those choices knowingly, and he had emerged victorious. But as he stood at the pinnacle of his success, there was a part of him that questioned whether it had all been worth it. The destruction he had caused, both to others and to himself, was undeniable. Emily, Cade, Laura, he had used them all, and in the process, he had lost more than just his marriage. He had lost something deeper, something intangible, but it was there, lingering in the quiet moments of reflection. James wasn't sure if he would ever have the answer to that question. But for now, he stood tall, unchallenged and secure in his position. The empire he had built was his alone, and he had no intention of letting anyone take it from him. Whether or not the price had been worth it, well, that was a question only time would answer. But for now, James celebrated his victory, knowing that, in the end, he had gotten everything he had ever wanted.